Yeah, so my name's Thomas, hello. I'm obviously very pleased to be here amongst, on the same stage as like some people who have done some really amazing work. And I am going to tell you about a project I did called the Toaster Project. And this basically started with the observation that much of what surrounds us and we rely on is basically just a kind of collection of different rocks and sludge kind of put together in a very clever way. So kind of metals and plastics, computers, microphones, projectors, and of course, electric toasters. And so I thought, okay, well, maybe I should just try and make a toaster starting from the ground. How does this kind of magical transformation take place? And I was also certainly inspired by The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, this, Douglas Adams book. And this kind of quote is from a situation that kind of stayed with me since I read this book when I was kind of 40 or something. And the situation is that the kind of hero who's like from 20th century Earth finds himself on a strange planet populated only by a kind of technologically primitive people. And, so he expects that to be able to become their god with his, command of, the elements and technology. But kind of, it dawns on him that without the rest of human society, he can barely make a sandwich, let alone a toaster. And in the book, he does go on to make a sandwich, and the villagers are just so amazed by this sandwich technology that they, he's elevated to priest of sandwich making. So I thought, okay, so I'm going to try and reverse engineer a toaster and, build it from the ground up. And I went and bought the cheapest toaster I could find, working on the kind of assumption that the cheapest would also be the simplest. And the cheapest toaster I could find was the Argos value range 2-slice toaster. And I took it apart and kind of was a bit perturbed. Because when you really start taking every little bit apart, including the capacitors, there's kind of 400 or so bits in this object that you can buy for kind of £3.94. And so that wasn't very good for my project. These bits were made of kind of 100 or so different materials. But I thought, okay, well, you've got to start somewhere, so I'll start with 5. And so steel, copper, mica, and plastic and nickel. And so I started with steel. I thought, okay, I'll try and make steel. How do you make steel? I went and, knocked on the door of the chair of Rio Tinto Advanced Mineral Extraction down at Imperial College and asked him, how do you make steel? And he said, well, you start off with iron. So I went to an iron mine, phoned them up, and spoke to this chap, Ray, and said, I'm calling from the RCA, I'm trying to make a toaster, can I come up and get some iron? And he said, yeah, sure. But when I got there, it emerged that he'd misheard me and thought I was trying to make a poster on the phone, so he wasn't expecting me to kind of want to mine some iron. But we had an interesting conversation.
The person doing this mass production doesn't really understand what he's doing anymore.
Yeah.
Whereas when you do it on a small scale, you have to understand every bit of the process. And what it's all about.
Yeah.
Big business destroys the humans really. They become automatons in a system. They're no longer human beings anymore.
Sorry to kind of, spring this on you, say.
Bed of limestone we're walking through is creased limestone, and that was produced by sea creatures 350 million years ago in a nice warm sunny atmosphere. And suddenly something changed and destroyed all that nice warm sunny atmosphere and produced a very murky sea, which produced the bed of rock which is above us. Most ancient civilizations are prophesying that there's going to be a big change in the world in 2012. when you study geology, you can see what's happened in the past in the world, terrific changes in the earth.
Yeah, so it was a mine once, but and Ray was a miner there, but now he's kind of running it as a kind of museum, and they have like Christmas displays and stuff. And yeah, but I got my iron ore and dragged it back to London on the train, and then of course was faced with the problem of, you know, how does this become metal? So I went back to Jan, Professor Cilliers at Imperial, and said, okay, so what do I do now? And he said, okay, go to the library. And so I went to the undergraduate library and looked in the books, you know, for metallurgy, and, you know, they were completely useless because they don't actually tell you how to, you know, extract iron. And so I ended up going to the History of Science library, and, you know, something that became apparent is that, you know, the smaller the scale you want to work on, the kind of further back in time you need to go. And so this book is the first, you know, mining textbook written in the West. It's kind of from the 15th century, and it's kind of dedicated to the most illustrious princes of Europe. And you know, this kind of, you know, nice, simple woodcut diagram was essentially what I ended up doing. And I asked Jan what, you know, he did, you know, wow, esteemed kind of guy working in mining. And he said, oh, you know, I mathematically model bubbles. And I was like, well, what has that got to do with mining? And, you know, he's kind of spent decades kind of working out the best shape and size of bubbles for a particular process in this kind of, you know, vast industry, and, you know, and in doing that, he's kind of improved the extraction of copper, perhaps by, you know, a fraction of a percent, but like scaled up to the kind of scales that we work on now. That's a kind of important thing to do. So basically, I ended up, you know, doing what that book, you know, the 15th century book, told me. Show me where she stood and fell. Then I stand and fall. Where yeah, so that's my version of a 15th century furnace. Instead of bellows, I had a leaf blower, and it actually worked quite well. I got up to kind of 1400 degrees Celsius, but then the furnace itself kind of melted itself, and so the process didn't quite complete, which was actually, again, really depressing, because, you know, trying to convince the health and safety guys to let me do it at, you know, this was at college, it took weeks, and, you know, I wasn't going to be able to do it again. So in the end, I, you know, used a microwave to finish off the process, and kind of 30 minutes at full power, as long as you insulate everything, you can get up to temperature. Okay, so copper was my next material. Again, this involved going to a copper mine on the Isle of Anglesey, and this mine was at one stage the largest mine in the world, but of course it's not working anymore because it just can't compete with the kind of copper mines in, you know, South America. Oh, there's no sound. Oh, okay, well, it's not that interesting anyway. Basically, I'm getting some water from this mine, some mineral water perhaps, but the water is water that runs through a mine it becomes slightly acidic, and then it starts dissolving all the minerals from that mine. And Rio Tinto, in fact, is, you know, a place. It's called Red River, and that's because, you know, there was the Rio Tinto copper mine there. And so now this water has got loads of stuff in it. It's kind of highly acidic. There is some bacteria that can survive in it, extremophiles. But it's also got enough copper, which I could extract, using electrolysis to make the pins for my plug for the toaster. So next, okay, here's another video. I don't know if it's got sound. Next, I was trying to get mica, and mica is the sort of the grey board which the elements of toasters are wrapped around. So the mine might be up there, or might be somewhere else. There you go. Then wrap the element around there. It's crazy stuff. Uh-oh. Oh God, I've started a lock. Okay. Nice. Yeah, so that's Mica. Really nice trip. So plastic, I was, concerned that my toaster had to have a plastic case. It's the kind of defining feature of, consumer products. And so plastic comes from oil. So I phoned up BP. This is before their kind of current problems, and spent kind of, half an hour on the phone to the kind of PR guy trying to convince him that it would be fantastic PR if BP flew me to an oil rig and, let me have some oil. I don't know. I don't know. Maybe if I'd spoke for another, gone at him for another half an hour, he might have relented. But, in the end, he said, "Okay, well, we'll phone you back." And never did, surprisingly. So, there are other ways of making plastic, bioplastics. There's, bio-oils, which then can be made into bioplastics. But there's also starch-based plastics. So I got some potatoes and, extracted the starch and then kind of cooked them up and poured this plastic into my mould. And for a while it was looking really good, but you have to leave it to dry. So I left it outside to dry, and when I came back the next day, it was kind of all cracking, and there were also snails kind of all over it, like feasting on the unplasticated, starch. So then I realised that, we've kind of had metals for sort of the past, however many thousand years, but plastics have only been around for the last kind of 100 or so years, and that difference in kind of time scale kind of reflects the difference in sort of complexity in actually kind of trying to make it yourself. So I decided that I would have to think a bit laterally, and discovered that current geologists have christened the age we're living in a new geological epoch called the Anthropocene, and that's because, somebody in the far, far future would be able to see a sharp shift in the strata of rock that is being laid down now. Suddenly there'd be this kind of mass extinction event, and it would all become radioactive again, and there'd also be kind of strange new molecules floating around, polymers, plastics. So I decided that I could mine some of this kind of current age rock from a rubbish dump, but I went up to Manchester to...
The way the legislation's been implemented is a kind of everything into the melting pot together will divide up that huge tonnage according to the market share that you put on the market, and then you just have to buy evidence from a compliance scheme to show that you've done it. So with that everybody's stuff goes into the pot together approach, the opportunity for any individual producer to take real responsibility for their products is really diminished. So if I, as Dell or Hewlett Packard, said, right, I'm going to invest millions of pounds into product redesign, minimise the number of materials, go for ease of dismantling, maybe use some of the clever dismantling technologies that exist, because if I got all my Hewlett Packard products back, I could put them through a plant and ping them apart really cleverly, and I'd know all the plastics, I'd know all the metals, I'd know all the circuit boards, and I could then with confidence use it. That would be individual closed loop producer responsibility. there's no benefit for that under the legislation.
Yeah.
This is
Bit of car in there, isn't there? I think.
this is some plastic from a fridge process, which is just awful.
Right.
You can't get any yield out of that at all.
Yeah.
The process chain to go from oil to a polymer is very chemically reactive type chain, you know, and you're going to have to, on a micro scale, duplicate a great big oil refinery and a massive great polymerisation plant. So doing that in your kitchen, I think, would be extremely dangerous and also probably impossible.
Yeah, therefore,
your only option, I think, is to say, well, there's an existing mine of materials, which is waste plastic. Where can I access some waste plastic that will be good enough to do it? Does flame retardancy mean anything to you at all?
Yeah. I mean, I know about them from the bioaccumulation standpoint of brominated flame retardants. I was wondering if I could actually mine some brominated flame retardants from myself and put them in my toaster. But
oh dear, oh dear.
it seems to me, is, you know, virgin polymers, they're done on like giant, you know, humongous scales. And then it kind of goes to, you know, the consumer as like this small scale object, and then, you know, somehow, you know, then it kind of goes on and somehow it's got to get back up to like the giant scale again. But the trouble is that in the meantime it's kind of
all mixed
up and all, you know, and blah blah, there's crumbs in it. That's the cost price, that's materials only, that wouldn't include my labour. And so, yeah, so obviously this project is kind of about economies of scale. And you know, so on the one hand, you know, I think it's, well, you know, I was trying to kind of poke fun at this kind of romantic idea of, yes, we could all, you know, kind of downshift and go and live an organic life in the woods and kind of be self-sufficient. Because I think that's a kind of romantic idea, but it's also kind of, you know, false. But then on the flip side of that, you know, there is such a lot of effort and kind of thought and, you know, material and industry which goes into kind of making stuff like toasters, which, you know, you buy for kind of £3.50 or whatever, a throwaway price, and then kind of, you know, throw them away again. So somewhere between those two, yeah, that's what I think we should aim for. Thanks.